The autumn wind moved through the tall corn stalks as Elijah Morrow walked slowly back toward his farmhouse after a long day of work in the fields, and he could feel the tiredness in his old bones as he carried his tools over his shoulder and watched the sun sink below the horizon in shades of orange and purple that painted the Kansas sky like a masterpiece from heaven itself. He was 58 years old now, and he had lived on this farm his entire life, just as his father had before him, and his grandfather before that, and the land held memories in every corner that sometimes made his heart ache with both joy and sorrow at the same time. His wife Maria had passed away 3 years ago from an illness that no doctor could cure, and since then Elijah had lived alone, with only his animals and his memories to keep him company through the long nights, when the silence of the farmhouse felt too heavy to bear. But Elijah was not a man who complained about his troubles, or felt sorry for himself, because he believed that life was a gift, and every sunrise was a chance to do something good in the world, even if that good was simply feeding his chickens, or fixing a broken fence, or helping a neighbor who needed a hand. The year was 2247, and the world had changed in ways that would have seemed like magic to his ancestors, because humanity had made contact with beings from other planets and joined something called the Galactic Collective, that included hundreds of alien species from across the stars. But here on his little farm in Kansas, things remained much the same as they had always been, with crops that needed tending and animals that needed care, and seasons that came and went like the steady breathing of the earth itself. Elijah did not think much about the aliens or the politics of the galaxy, because such things seemed very far away from his simple life, and he preferred it that way because he found peace in the rhythm of farming and the steady cycles of nature. Honest work of his hands. As he reached his porch and set down his tools, he noticed his old dog, Buck, lifting his head and staring toward the eastern sky with ears perked up in a way that usually meant something unusual was happening. Elijah turned to look, and his breath caught in his throat as he saw a streak of bright light cutting across the darkening sky like a falling star. But this was no ordinary meteor, because it was moving in a strange pattern and seemed to be slowing down as it got closer to the ground. The light disappeared behind the tree line at the edge of his property, and then he heard a tremendous crash that shook the ground beneath his feet and sent birds flying from the trees in every direction with cries of alarm. His heart was pounding now, but Elijah was not a man who ran from trouble, so he grabbed a flashlight from inside the door and called for Buck to follow him as he headed toward the cornfield where the object had fallen. Through the tall corn stalks felt longer than usual because his mind was racing with questions about what he might find, and part of him wondered if he should call someone for help. But his curiosity and his instinct to help drove him forward into the unknown. When he finally pushed through the last row of corn and entered the clearing that the crash had created, he stopped and stared in amazement at what lay before him in the dim light of his flashlight. A small vessel, about the size of his pickup truck, sat crumpled and smoking in a crater of torn earth and broken corn stalks, and strange symbols glowed faintly on its surface in colors that Elijah had never seen before in his life. He approached carefully and could feel heat radiating from the twisted metal as he circled around to what looked like an opening in the side of the craft, and through the smoke and sparks he could see that something was moving inside. Elijah leaned closer and aimed his flashlight into the darkness of the wrecked vessel, and what he saw made his heart break into 1,000 pieces right there in that Kansas cornfield under the emerging stars. A tiny creature lay among the debris, no bigger than a newborn kitten, with fur that shimmered in colors of purple and silver, even through the dirt and blood that covered its small body. And it had 6 little legs that twitched weakly, and large eyes that reflected the light of his flashlight like 2 moons. The creature was making a sound that needed no translation, because it was the universal language of fear and pain and loneliness that any living being could understand. A weak, mewling cry that begged for help from anyone who would listen. Elijah did not hesitate for even a single second, because he had spent his whole life taking care of creatures who could not take care of themselves, and he had never turned away from any living thing that needed his help, regardless of how it looked or where it came from. He reached into the wreckage very gently and scooped the tiny creature into his weathered hands, feeling how it trembled against his palms like a frightened bird, and he could tell that it was badly hurt from the crash. The creature flinched at first and let out a tiny cry of fear, but Elijah began to speak to it in the same soft voice he used with scared animals, telling it that everything was going to be okay, and that he would not let anything hurt it anymore. He took off his old flannel jacket and wrapped the creature carefully inside it, creating a warm and safe cocoon against his chest, where it could feel the steady beating of his heart. And something amazing happened in that moment. The little creature stopped struggling, and its large, luminous eyes looked up at Elijah with an expression that seemed almost like wonder, as if it could not believe that someone was actually trying to help it instead of hurt it. Elijah held it close and began walking back toward his farmhouse, with Buck trotting beside him, and he talked to the creature the whole way, because he wanted it to know that it was not alone anymore, and that someone cared about whether it lived or died. When he reached the house, he cleared off the kitchen table and laid the creature down gently under the warm light, examining its injuries with the careful eye of a man who had doctored many animals over the years. There were cuts and burns on its tiny body, and one of its 6 legs was bent at a wrong angle, but Elijah could see that it was breathing steadily, and its eyes were still bright with life, which gave him hope that it could survive if he helped it. He gathered bandages and medicine and clean water, working through the night to tend to every wound with patience and tenderness, and he kept talking to the creature in his gentle voice, because he believed that kindness was a language that every living thing could understand. As the first light of dawn began to color the sky outside his window, Elijah sat in his chair beside the kitchen table, where the little creature now slept peacefully for the first time since the crash. Its eyes had finally closed, and its breathing was calm and steady, and though it still trembled slightly, it had stopped crying and seemed to know somehow that it was finally safe. Elijah looked at this strange little being from somewhere among the stars, and felt something stir in his heart that he had not felt since Maria passed away, a sense of purpose and connection that made the loneliness fade just a little bit. He did not know what this creature was, or where it came from, or why it had crashed into his cornfield, but he knew one thing for certain as he watched over it while the sun rose over his farm. He would protect this little one with everything he had, because that was simply who Elijah Morrow was and who he had always been, a man who believed that every life was precious, and every creature deserved a chance to be loved. 3 weeks had passed since the night of the crash, and the little creature had grown stronger with each day under Elijah's patient care, eating the special food he prepared and sleeping in the warm bed he had made from soft blankets near the fireplace. Elijah had decided to call her Mira, which had been his wife Maria's nickname when they were young and in love, and somehow the name felt right for this small being who had brought light back into his quiet farmhouse. Mira's fur had become bright and beautiful now that she was healthy, shimmering with colors of purple and silver, and hints of blue that seemed to shift and dance whenever the light touched her. And her 6 little legs had all healed properly, including the one that had been broken. She followed Elijah everywhere he went around the farm like a tiny shadow, riding on his shoulder while he fed the chickens, or sitting beside him while he repaired fences, and she seemed to find endless wonder in the simple routines of farm life. But the most amazing thing about Mira was not her strange beauty, or her 6 legs, or the way she could climb walls and ceilings with ease. It was the way she could make him feel things that came directly from her heart to his. At first Elijah thought he was imagining it, but he soon realized that Mira could project her emotions outward like invisible waves that washed over anyone nearby. And he could feel her happiness when she played, and her contentment when she slept, and her love when she looked at him with those big moon-like eyes. She was learning to understand his words, too, tilting her head and responding with little sounds and emotional projections that made communication between them feel natural and easy, despite coming from different worlds. One evening, Elijah sat at his computer and searched for information about what species Mira might be, and what he found made his blood run cold and his heart fill with a terrible sadness. RP. Mira was a Velith, a member of one of the oldest and most powerful species in the entire galactic collective, and the Velith were known throughout the galaxy as cold and logical beings who valued strength and perfection above all else. They lived for thousands of years and possessed technology far beyond anything humans had ever created, and they looked down on most other species as primitive and inferior, especially emotional species like humans. But the thing that made Elijah's hands shake as he read was the section about Velith children who were born different. Children who had what the Velith considered defects or mutations that did not fit their idea of perfection. These children were taken from their families and abandoned on remote worlds to die alone, because the Velith believed that allowing them to live would weaken their species and bring shame to their bloodlines. The defect that was considered most shameful of all was being born an empath, a Velith who could feel and project emotions, because emotions were seen as a disease that the Velith had evolved beyond long ago. Elijah looked at Mira sleeping peacefully by the fire and felt tears running down his weathered cheeks as he understood what had happened to her. Because she was an empath, and her own people had thrown her away like garbage. Someone had put her in that escape pod and sent her to this remote planet to die alone in the dark, and that someone might have been her own mother or father, who saw her as nothing more than an embarrassment to be disposed of. He walked over and sat down beside her, gently stroking her shimmering fur, and Mira opened her eyes and looked up at him with trust and love that made his heart feel like it might burst. She could feel his sadness and his anger, and she did not understand why he was upset. So she climbed into his lap and pressed her small body against his chest and projected feelings of comfort toward him. Elijah held her close and whispered that everything was going to be okay, and that she was not a defect or a mistake. She was perfect exactly as she was, and anyone who could not see that was blind to the most important things in life. From that day forward, he loved her even more fiercely than before, determined to give her all the happiness and safety that her own people had denied her. And he vowed that no one would ever hurt her again as long as he lived. The weeks turned into months, and Mira grew bigger and smarter and more wonderful every day, learning to speak in broken words that mixed with her emotional projections to create a unique way of communicating. She called Elijah her warm father, because his love felt like warmth to her empathic senses, a constant glow of affection and protection that surrounded her like a blanket and made her feel safe for the first time in her young life. Elijah taught her about his farm and his world, values he believed in, like kindness and hard work and the importance of caring for those who could not care for themselves. Mira was fascinated by everything and asked endless questions about human life, amazed that a species the Velith considered primitive could be so full of love and warmth and connection with each other. She did not understand why her own people thought emotions were bad, because emotions were the most beautiful things she had ever experienced, and they seemed to be what made life worth living. Elijah explained that different cultures believed different things, and that sometimes even smart people could be very foolish about the things that mattered most. but he also warned her that her people might come looking for her someday. He had read that the Velith were very thorough, and that they often tracked their abandoned children to make sure they had died. And the crashed pod in his field might have sent out a signal that would lead them here, eventually. But when Mira became frightened by this possibility, Elijah held her and told her not to worry, because he would never let anyone take her away, and she could feel the truth of his words in the iron strength of his love. One cold winter night, as they sat together by the fire with snow falling softly outside the window, Mira asked Elijah why he had saved her when he did not know what she was or where she came from. Elijah thought about the question for a long moment, and then smiled, and said that he had spent his whole life believing that every living creature deserved kindness, and that helping those in need was simply the right thing to do. He told her that his mother had taught him this when he was a boy, and she had learned it from her mother before her, and that this belief had been passed down through his family for generations, like a precious treasure. Mira curled up closer to him, and said that she wanted to learn this way of thinking. Was so different from everything the Velith believed, and she wanted to be like him, and spread kindness wherever she went. Elijah laughed, and said that she already did spread kindness, because her gift of feeling and sharing emotions was not a defect at all. It was a superpower that let her connect with others in ways that most people could only dream of. As he spoke those words, a chill ran down his spine, because he heard a sound outside that did not belong to the quiet winter night, a deep humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He went to the window and looked up at the sky, and his heart nearly stopped when he saw the massive shape of a spacecraft descending through the falling snow, its lights cutting through the darkness like cold blue eyes. Mira felt his fear and began to tremble, and she pressed herself against his leg and projected a question that needed no words, because they both knew who had come and why. Elijah bent down and picked her up, holding her against his chest, where she could feel the steady beating of his heart. And he spoke in a voice that was calm and strong, despite the fear he felt inside. He told her that no matter what happened next, she should remember that she was loved, and that she was worthy of love. And he promised her that he would not let anyone take her without a fight. The spacecraft landed in his field, and Elijah Morrow walked to his front door and stood there waiting with Mira in his arms, a simple human farmer facing the might of one of the most powerful species in the galaxy. The spacecraft sat in the snow-covered field, like a monument to power and technology beyond human understanding. Its surface smooth and dark, and covered with symbols that glowed with cold blue light. Elijah stood on his porch with Mira clutched against his chest, watching as a ramp extended from the vessel, and a group of figures emerged into the falling snow, moving with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. There were 5 of them, and they were tall and elegant, with fur that was pure silver, and eyes that reflected light like mirrors, and they wore armor that looked like liquid metal flowing over their bodies. But it was the one in front who caught Elijah's attention, a female Velith who moved with an authority that made it clear she was the leader, and her eyes were as cold as the winter wind that cut across the field. She approached the farmhouse with her guards flanking her on both sides, and Mira began to tremble so violently that Elijah could feel it. Through his jacket, her fear projecting outward in waves that made his skin prickle. The female Velith stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Elijah with an expression of barely concealed disgust, as if she had expected to find something unpleasant, and her expectations had been exceeded. She spoke in a voice that was beautiful and terrible at the same time, every word precise and cold, like chips of ice falling on stone. She introduced herself as High Commander Saravan of the Velith Dominion, and demanded to know why a primitive human was holding property of the Velith Empire, using the word property to describe Mira as if she were an object rather than a living being. Elijah felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice steady as he responded that he was holding his daughter, who he had found injured and alone, and had nursed back to health with his own hands. Saravin's silver eyes narrowed, and she made a sound that might have been laughter, if it had contained any warmth, saying that the defective Kit was not his daughter, and could never be anything to a creature as insignificant as a human. She explained that she had come to collect the Kit for proper disposal according to Velith law, and she suggested that Elijah hand it over immediately, so that this unpleasant business could be concluded quickly. Elijah looked down at Mira, who was staring at Saravin with an expression of pure terror, and he could feel through her empathic connection that she recognized this Velith female somehow. He asked Mira who this person was, and Mira's voice came out as barely a whisper when she answered that this was her birth mother, the one who had placed her in the pod and sent her away to die. The words hit Elijah like a physical blow, and he turned back to Saravin with eyes that burned with a fury he had rarely felt in his peaceful life, demanding to know how she could throw away her own child like garbage. Saravin seemed unmoved by his anger, and explained that the Kit was born defective, with the emotional contamination that disgraced their ancient bloodline, and that disposing of such aberrations was not cruelty, but kindness for the greater good of their species. She spoke about genetic purity, and the weakness of emotion, and the shame that empaths brought to their families, reciting these beliefs as if they were obvious truths that only a fool would question. Elijah listened to her words, and felt a sadness mixing with his anger, because he could see that Saravin truly believed what she was saying, that she had been taught these terrible ideas so thoroughly that she could not recognize the evil in them. He shook his head slowly, and told her that where he came from, they judged people by how they treated those who could not defend themselves, and that throwing away a child because she was different was the worst kind of cowardice. Flickered for just a moment, something passing behind her cold eyes that might have been surprise or confusion, or something deeper that she quickly suppressed. She told Elijah that he did not understand Velith culture, and that his primitive human emotions were clouding his judgment, and she warned him that defying the Velith dominion would have consequences for his entire species. Elijah straightened his back and met her gaze without flinching, telling her that he did not care about politics or consequences, or the opinion of people who abandoned their children. He declared that Mira was his daughter now, and that he loved her, and that he would protect her with his life, and no one was going to take her away from him as long as there was breath in his body. The silence that followed his words seemed to freeze the very air around them, and the Velith guards exchanged looks of disbelief that a mere human would dare speak this way to a high commander. Stared at him for a long moment, and then informed him that his defiance was noted, and that she would return with the full authority of the Dominion to collect what belonged to them. She warned him that humans were insignificant in the galaxy, and that standing against the Velith was foolishness that would bring nothing but suffering to his world. But as she spoke, something unexpected happened that made everyone freeze in place and stare at the small creature in Elijah's arms. Mira raised her head and looked directly at her birth mother, and she began to project her emotions outward with a power she had never used before, sending waves of feeling that washed over everyone present. She projected her memories of being abandoned, the terror and loneliness and confusion of waking up in a crashed pod on a strange world, and the despair of believing that no one would ever love her. And then she projected her memories of Elijah, the warmth of his hands when he lifted her from the wreckage, and the gentleness in his voice when he promised to keep her safe, and the steady glow of his love that had never wavered for even a single moment. She projected the difference between the coldness of being thrown away and the warmth of being treasured, letting everyone feel exactly what it meant to be abandoned and exactly what it meant to be loved. The Velith guards stumbled backward as if struck by an invisible force, their faces showing emotions they had been trained since birth to suppress. And one of them actually fell to his knees in the snow. But it was Saravan who showed the most dramatic reaction, her silver eyes going wide, and her elegant body beginning to tremble as she felt things she had not allowed herself to feel in centuries. For one brief moment, her mask cracked completely, and Elijah saw something beneath the cold surface, a flicker of pain and regret, and something that might have been longing. But then Saravan forced her expression back to coldness and turned away sharply, ordering her guards to return to the ship and speaking in a voice that was not quite as steady as before. She told Elijah over her shoulder that this was not over, and that she would bring the matter before the Dominion Council. And then she walked back to her ship without looking at Mira again. Elijah watched the spacecraft rise into the sky and disappear into the falling snow. And then he looked down at Mira, who was exhausted from the effort of projecting her emotions so powerfully. He carried her inside and sat down by the fire, holding her close and stroking her fur while she recovered her strength, telling her how brave she had been and how proud he was of her. Mira looked up at him with tired eyes and asked if the cold mother would come back to take her away, her voice small and frightened in a way that broke his heart. Elijah pulled her closer and promised her that he would never let that happen, speaking the words with a conviction that came from the deepest part of his soul. He did not know how he would keep that promise against the power of the Veleth Dominion, but he knew that he would find a way, because giving up was simply not something he knew how to do. As Mira fell asleep in his arms, Elijah stared into the fire and thought about what was coming, knowing that the hardest part of this fight was still ahead of them. But he also thought about what Mira had done on that porch, the way she had made those cold beings feel something they had forgotten they could feel. And he wondered if maybe there was more power in love than anyone realized. The story of Elijah Morrow and his alien daughter spread across Earth like wildfire in the days following the confrontation with the Veleth, carried by news networks and social media and word of mouth, until it seemed like everyone on the planet knew about the farmer who had defied an ancient empire. People called him a hero, and they called Mira an angel, and they said that this simple man from Kansas represented everything that was good about humanity, the willingness to protect the innocent, regardless of the cost. But the story did not stop at Earth, because it traveled through the galactic networks as well, reaching billions of beings on thousands of worlds, who listened with amazement to the tale of a primitive human standing up to the mighty Veleth. Some laughed at the foolishness of this farmer who did not understand his place in the galaxy, but many others felt something stir in their hearts, a recognition of courage that they had perhaps forgotten existed. The Veleth Dominion was not amused by any of this, and they responded with anger to what they saw as an insult to their honor and a challenge to their ancient traditions. High Commander Saravan brought the matter before the Dominion Council and demanded that they take action to retrieve the defective kit and punish the human who had dared to defy them. The Council agreed unanimously and sent a formal message to Earth's government demanding that Elijah surrender Mira immediately, or face severe sanctions that would harm humanity's position in the Galactic Collective. The politicians in their distant capitals were frightened by this threat, and they sent representatives to Elijah's farm to convince him to cooperate, explaining that the future of humanity's relationship with the galaxy was at stake. Elijah listened politely to their arguments and their warnings and their pleas, and then he told them that he understood their concerns, but that he could not hand over his daughter to people who wanted to kill her. The representatives grew frustrated and asked him how he could put one alien creature above the interests of his entire species, suggesting that he was being selfish and short-sighted. Elijah shook his head and replied that surrendering an innocent child to her executioners was not something he could live with, and that any society that would expect him to do so had lost sight of what truly mattered. He told them that humanity had fought too many wars and committed too many crimes against the helpless throughout its history, and that maybe it was time to draw a line and say that some things were simply not acceptable. The representatives left without convincing him and reported back to their superiors that the farmer would not budge, and the news of his refusal spread even further and inspired even more people around the world. Ordinary humans began showing their support in countless ways, both small and large. Large, holding signs outside government buildings, and writing letters and creating art and music dedicated to Elijah and Mira. Families who had adopted children shared their own stories of love that transcended blood, and rescue organizations spoke about the importance of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The message that emerged from all of this was simple and powerful, a declaration that humanity did not abandon its children, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. But the support was not limited to Earth, because other species in the Galactic Collective began to speak out as well, especially younger civilizations who had long resented the arrogance of the Valeth. They called for the collective to intervene and protect both Mira and Elijah, arguing that the ancient practice of abandoning children was barbaric and had no place in a modern galaxy. The Valeth Dominion responded to this growing opposition by sending a fleet of warships to Earth's orbit, a show of force designed to intimidate both humans and their alien supporters into silence. The ships hung in the sky like dark omens, visible from the ground as moving stars that reminded everyone of the power arrayed against one old farmer and his adopted daughter. Earth's government sent another message to Elijah, begging him to reconsider, warning that the Valeth might take military action if he continued to refuse. But he would not change his mind. Then something remarkable happened that no one had expected, as a journalist from a galactic news network requested permission to interview Elijah and broadcast the conversation live across the entire collective. Elijah agreed, because he wanted people to understand why he was doing what he was doing, and he wanted them to see Mira and know that she was not a defect, but a wonderful child who deserved to live. The interview took place in his farmhouse, with Mira sitting in his lap, and billions of beings across thousands of worlds watched as this simple human spoke about love and family and the courage to do what was right. The journalist asked him if he understood the consequences of his actions, and Elijah smiled and said that he understood them very well, but that some things were more important than consequences. He explained that his wife Maria had taught him that the measure of a person was not found in their wealth or power, but in how they treated those who could not fight back. And Mira could not fight back. He spoke about finding her in the wreckage of that crashed pod, scared and hurt and alone, and about how she had trusted him with her life, even though he was a stranger from a species she had never seen. He talked about watching her grow and learn and discover joy in simple things, and about how her ability to feel and share emotions was not a curse, but a gift that the galaxy desperately needed. When the journalist asked if he had any message for the Valeth, Elijah looked directly into the camera and spoke words that would be remembered for generations. He said that where he came from, they judged people by how they treated those who could not fight back, and that this little one could not fight back, and that he would stand for her as long as he had breath in his body. Mira looked up at him with her big shining eyes, and then turned to face the camera, and she spoke in her broken words, mixed with emotional projections that let everyone watching feel her love and her gratitude. She called Elijah her warm father, and said that he had taught her that being able to feel was not a bad thing, and that love was the most powerful force in the universe. The broadcast ended, and the galaxy fell silent, as billions of beings processed what they had witnessed, this simple display of love between a human and an alien child that challenged everything the Valeth had taught for millennia. Flagship orbiting Earth, High Commander Seraphine sat alone in her quarters, watching a recording of the interview for the third time, her silver eyes fixed on the image of her daughter's face. She had spent centuries suppressing every emotion, believing as she had been taught that feelings were weakness and logic was strength. But the words of that human farmer echoed in her mind and would not be silenced. She remembered the moment on the porch when Mira had projected her emotions, the wave of love and warmth that had broken through defenses Saravan had spent lifetimes building. For the first time, in longer than she could remember, the High Commander allowed herself to wonder if everything she believed might be wrong, if the Veleth had somehow lost their way along the path to perfection. She looked at the image of Mira, happy and healthy and loved, sitting in the lap of a primitive human who cherished her as the greatest treasure in the universe. Privacy of her quarters, where no one could see, Saravan allowed a single tear to fall from her silver eyes before she forced her face back to its mask of cold composure. The Dominion Council was demanding action, and the fleet was waiting for orders. But the High Commander found herself hesitating at a crossroads she had never expected to reach. The galaxy watched and waited to see what would happen next, not knowing that the fate of more than just one little girl hung in the balance. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Collective was the largest structure ever built by intelligent beings, a massive chamber floating in space where representatives from hundreds of species gathered to decide the fate of civilizations. Elijah Morrow stood in the center of this enormous room, feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life, surrounded by beings of every shape and size and color imaginable, all of them watching him with expressions he could not read. Mira stood beside him, with her 6 legs planted firmly on the smooth floor, and her head held high, projecting calm confidence, even though he could feel her nervousness through their bond. The Dominion Council had demanded a formal tribunal to decide the matter once and for all, and the Galactic Collective had agreed to host it, making this the most watched event in the history of the known galaxy. High Commander Saravan stood on the opposite side of the chamber, with a delegation of Veleth officials behind her, their silver fur gleaming under the lights that illuminated the space. The leader of the tribunal was an ancient being from a species called the Architects, one of the oldest civilizations in existence, and her voice resonated through the hall as she called the proceedings to order. The Veleth representative spoke first, presenting their case with cold logic and appeals to tradition, arguing that the Kit belonged to the Dominion by blood and law, and that no other species had the right to interfere. He spoke about genetic purity and the danger of allowing defective individuals to survive and weaken the species, presenting these arguments as if they were self-evident truths beyond dispute. When he finished, the tribunal leader turned to Elijah and asked him to explain why he believed he had the right to defy the laws of another civilization. Elijah looked around the vast chamber at all the beings watching him and felt the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders, knowing that what he said in the next few minutes might change everything. He began speaking in his simple, honest way, telling them about his life on the farm and the values his parents had taught him, and the night he had found a scared little creature in the wreckage of a crashed pod. He explained that he had not known what Mira was or where she came from, only that she was hurt and alone and needed help, and that helping her had been as natural as breathing. He talked about watching her heal and grow and learn, about the joy she brought to his lonely farmhouse, and the love that had developed between them, a love that knew no boundaries of species or world. Then his voice grew stronger as he addressed the heart of the matter, the question of whether emotions were weakness or strength, and whether abandoning children was tradition or tragedy. He said that he was just a simple farmer who did not understand politics or galactic law, understood one thing that seemed to be missing from the Veleth arguments. He understood that love was not weakness, but the greatest strength any being could possess, and that protecting the vulnerable was not foolishness, but the highest calling of any civilization. He looked directly at the Veleth delegation, and ask them what kind of society they had built, if it required throwing away children who were capable of feeling, if their definition of perfection excluded the very thing that made life worth living. He asked them to imagine a galaxy where no one cared about anyone else, where logic had completely replaced compassion and efficiency had replaced kindness, and whether that was really the future they wanted. Then he turned back to the tribunal and made his final plea, speaking words that came from the deepest part of his heart. He said that he was not asking them to change Velith law or interfere with another civilization's beliefs. He was only asking them to let one little girl live and be loved. He said that Mira had done nothing wrong except be born with the ability to feel, and that punishing her for this gift was the greatest injustice he could imagine. When he finished speaking, there was silence in the great hall as the assembled beings considered his words. And then something unexpected happened that changed everything. Mira stepped forward and asked permission to address the tribunal. Her small voice barely audible in the vast chamber, but her request heard by everyone. The tribunal leader granted permission, and Mira walked to the center of the floor, standing alone under the lights with billions of eyes watching her. She did not speak with words, because words were not her gift. Instead, she did what she had been born to do, and projected her emotions outward with all the power she possessed. She shared her memories of the cold darkness before Elijah found her, the terror and despair of being abandoned by everyone who should have loved her. She shared her memories of waking up in his warm farmhouse, of gentle hands and kind words, and a heart that opened to accept her without question or hesitation. She shared the feeling of being loved unconditionally for the first time in her life, the warmth that had healed wounds far deeper than the cuts on her body. And finally, she shared her love for Elijah, the overwhelming gratitude and devotion she felt for the human who had saved her life and given her a family. The wave of emotion washed over the entire assembly, and beings who had not felt anything in centuries found tears streaming down their faces and warmth blooming in their hearts. Even the Velith delegation was affected, their carefully maintained composure cracking as they experienced something they had spent their whole lives denying. The tribunal leader waited until the emotional projection faded, and then called for a vote, and one by one the representatives cast their decisions. The result was overwhelming, with hundreds of species voting to grant Mira protected status, and only a handful of abstentions, and no votes against. The tribunal declared that Mira would be recognized as Elijah's adopted daughter under a new law called the Interspecies Compassion Accord, which would protect any being who was abandoned or mistreated by their own kind. As the chamber erupted in celebration, Elijah lifted Mira into his arms and held her close, feeling her joy and relief radiating through their bond. But there was one more moment that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Something that happened after the tribunal had ended and the crowd had begun to disperse. High Commander Seraphine approached him slowly, her silver eyes fixed on Mira with an expression that was difficult to read, but no longer seemed cold. She stood before them in silence for a long moment, and then spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, a voice that trembled with emotions she had suppressed for centuries. She did not ask for forgiveness, because she knew she did not deserve it. She only wanted to thank him for showing her something her people had forgotten long ago. She said that watching Mira grow up loved and happy had forced her to question everything she had ever believed, and that his courage had planted a seed that might someday change the Velith forever. Then she did something that no Velith had done in recorded history. She bowed her head to a human and acknowledged him as her superior in the only thing that truly mattered. Elijah accepted her thanks with grace and told her that it was never too late to choose a different path, and that he hoped she would find peace. 1 year later, on a warm spring evening, Elijah sat on his porch, watching Mira chase fireflies across the field, while the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and gold. His little girl had grown so much in the past months, confident and happy and full of wonder at the beautiful world she now called home. The galaxy had changed in ways large and small since the tribunal, with beings everywhere beginning to question traditions that cause suffering and to embrace the radical idea that compassion was strength. But on this small farm in Kansas, things were much the same as they had always been, with crops that needed tending and animals that needed care and love that needed to be shared. Mira came running back to the porch and climbed into his lap, her fur shimmering in the fading light and her eyes bright with the joy of simply being alive. She asked him to tell her a story, and he smiled and began to speak, his gentle voice carrying across the field as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The story he told was about a lonely farmer who found a treasure in his cornfield, a treasure that taught him that love could echo across the stars and change the universe in ways both small and magnificent. And somewhere out among those stars, beings who had once believed that emotions were weakness looked up at the night sky and felt something warm stirring in their ancient hearts, because the simplest truth in all the cosmos turned out to be something that an old human farmer had known all along, that kindness was the greatest power in the universe, and love was its eternal flame.